that one, a section of the Muslims, Arab Muslims, are today reaching out to Israel. And they also see common ground with India. And so it is actually, it kind of doesn't fit into the notion that religion is the only factor that decides a foreign policy.
So this week in Rajamandala, you start off with this formulation from I think Egyptian academic, Muhammad Suleiman, who talks about the Indo-Abrahamic Accord, sort of taking off from the Abrahamic Accords between Israel and certain other Arab countries. One of the interesting things you bring up in the piece towards the end, everyone should read the piece. It will be on the IndianExpress.com, of course, but also probably where you're watching this video and on social media. But in the piece, one of the things you sort of hint at is that it seems as though foreign policy in this kind of formulation is being viewed all through an almost religious prism. Even, I mean, and that could be one of the criticisms, that it's Indo as a sort of thing for Hindu, Abrahamic can be both now no longer just Jewish, of course, but also Jewish in certain moderate Muslim countries, particularly the United Arab Emirates in this current scenario. Do you see that as, in the larger sense, in the longer term, being something to worry about, that these kinds of things are, this is just a paper writer, just an idea, but being framed in this sort of way?
No, as I mentioned in the paper, look, I mean, religion is not out of it. Even the countries which, like India, which said, look, religion is not a factor in its foreign policy. But if you go back to 1947, Nehru takes charge, there is partition of India on religious lines. And Pakistan is trying to mobilize the Islamic world in the name of religious solidarity. And India had to counter that. I mean, India had to deal with that. I mean, by focusing on Arab nationalism, non-alignment, third world solidarity. So I think religion is such a powerful force. It does not disappear from international politics. But the main argument in my paper is to get a correct perspective on the role of religion in these issues. For example, the idea of pan-Islamism, which Pakistan was betting so much on, has not really solved the problems of the Islamic world. It's as divided as it always was. Similarly, the idea of pan-Asianism, those kind of issues, or like India, the only Hindu country in the world is Nepal, and we have problems with them. So, and Christian world, of course, is always fought with each other. So therefore, but is religion play a role in the Middle East? Of course, it plays a role. The question here is, I think Suleiman is not framing it in religious terms. He's saying, look, actually, the Indo-Abrahamic Accords is actually a break through the religious divide. Yeah. That one, a section of the Muslims, Arab Muslims, are today reaching out to Israel. And they also see common ground with India. And so it is actually, it kind of doesn't fit into the notion that religion is the only factor that decides a foreign policy. As I mentioned, look, there are Pakistanis who believe, Hindu, Yahudi conspiracy is always there to undermine Pakistan. And there are people in India who think India and Hindus and Jews are natural allies. But the fact that India has become so close to Saudi Arabia and UAE, and those two countries are dealing with Israel, shows, look, religion is not the only factor in international politics. There are other considerations like interests, economic considerations, and the ultimately political and national interests. So all of them are at play. So it is the important thing to understand how the relative balance plays out in these, rather than framing it in purely either religious terms or purely secular terms. Yeah. For example, many in India have always argued that the only thing that matters is Arab-Israeli conflict. And that's not a religious conflict. It is one of determination, or between imperialism and the Arabs. But the world has not worked along those lines as well. But to conclude this point, I mean, that look, there is today a contest between Turkey, which claims leadership of the Islamic world, and seeks to undermine other Islamic countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. So the so-called moderate Islamic countries are coming together, one hand trying to build a moderate Arab center, as well as building coalitions with with non-Islamic countries like Israel or India. And similarly, Turkey itself is a member of NATO. It still has good relations with Israel, or not good, it has relationship with Israel. So I think people use it instrumentally, religion, but religion is a factor that is out there. But the important thing is to have the correct appreciation of what exact role it is playing at any given juncture.
So, you talk about how Erdogan's Turkey being expansive in the region, asserting itself in various ways, has opened up this opportunity for India towards its west, much like in the Indo-Pacific, we now have certain kinds of groupings, like the Quad going forward. But how do you see that playing out? And India has been traditionally shy. Even now on the Quad, there are so many misgivings among certain circles within India and beyond. How do you see this playing out towards the West in terms of economic resources, in terms of other kinds of strategic resources? What does India need to commit?
My sense is, look, I think in terms of new opportunities, for example, we never thought of Eastern Mediterranean, for example, as part of the Middle East. Yeah. Though we had great interest in Greece, because Greece and India were ranged against Turkey and Pakistan on the Turkish-Cyprus question. There was this contestation. But Turkey, and Greece seemed to fall off our map in the last many years. But now, because of the Greek-Turkish confrontation, Greece is very enthusiastic, and India is now beginning to engage them and do more things with Greece. So I think the conflicts between different groups and India's rise produce a convergence that countries are looking to India to see if we can do more for them. So that brings me to the question of whether we have the resources and the political will to do more things. One, I think India's interests in the region have dramatically grown. That today India's oil imports from the Gulf are large. India today deploys ships in this part of the world in a much bigger way than before. And there are many countries that look to India for security support, security cooperation. So that all those have increased. So India's interest, as well as India's willingness to commit resources, have increased. Of course, is it endless commitment? No, India is not going to put boots on the ground. But there are things that India can do. Diplomatic support, political support, and military training, military support, those kind of things. I think India is well within the capability of India to do those things. But what is important is Turkey is driving us into a situation by forcing a confrontation with India on Kashmir that India now needs to push back. So that is a temporary thing, how we push back. But the longer term thing is there are interests today for India. Israel is a stronger partner today. And if Egypt, Israel, and Greece come together in Eastern Mediterranean and turn to India and say, look, could you help us? Could you join us in exercises? Of course, India would do it. Just as Turkey is coming into Afghanistan, is trying to run the airport with Pakistan's help. So I think both Turkey and India are rising powers. They're expanding their footprint. So there is going to be some friction. But for India, I think important thing is to think of the Middle East not just as West Asia, as the Gulf, but as a greater Middle East, as I said, where cross-cutting interactions, all these demand a larger Indian role. And we need to break out of many of our own shibboleths, if you will, on how we thought about the region. It is just about America versus the Middle East, Americans leaving. In fact, that is one new consideration. Or that it's all about Israel and Palestine. But Palestine question is no longer the determining factor for some Arabs. And some Arabs feel either Iran is a bigger threat than Israel, or some feel Turkey is a bigger threat than Israel. So I think the old truisms are breaking down, and that India must be prepared to deal with this far more complicated and a region where there's shifting alliances, where actually India will find it has a lot of possibilities to engage with actors that it has not in the recent past.
So the final question, there's an interesting, actually, it's a little less connected perhaps in some ways, but you spoke about how Egypt is so central when you're in the article. There's that section that Nasser and Nehru actually had plans to sort of build fighter jets together, do this sort of defense production and strategic cooperation at a level where you're making aircraft together and things of that nature. Do you see us with any country really, of say relative equal terms, doing that kind of Atmanirbharta, if you will, in the near future? That kind of, because that is a true friendship. I mean, a truly close partnership would entail something like that?
No, I think I wanted to mention that project because, many Indians think it's somehow Nehru was a woolly-headed idealist, all this or feel-good non-alignment, Asian solidarity. I mean, that's one part of it. I mean, we can argue on it whether it was right or wrong. But he was also trying to construct partnerships in the 50s. Of course, things went crazily wrong in the 60s, both with Egypt, for example, Indonesia. On the eastern side, we had a security cooperation agreement. Nehru signed a security agreement with Burma. Nehru gave security guarantees to Nepal. So there was a security element to Indian foreign policy from the beginning. But later, we put it all under, we are nice boys, we don't do this kind of stuff, we are non-aligned, we don't do military cooperation. That was a later addition to what was the original conception. So today, for example, something similar is entirely possible. Like we buy things from Israel, but can we do more things in producing things with Israel? I mean, some of that probably will develop. UAE, for example, has long been asking India, can we do a co-production of weapons? Because UAE has lots of money. India has a fairly large defense interest. For example, UAE is trying to say, look, we will produce a gun in India for the armed forces, for the army. I don't know where exactly the deal is today. So there are new possibilities. On space cooperation, for example, Israel is a fairly advanced space industry. India has a huge space industry. UAE has actually doing more things, very interesting things in space for a small country. And they're saying, look, let's work together. So I think it's India which has to shed some of its previous inhibitions, recently acquired inhibitions, and say, look, there are possibilities to work with others. For example, Israel and UAE plan to set up innovation parks. And India is in the same business. So if we can, three of us can pool our resources. India's engagement with other Arab countries is also growing. And so there will be opportunities, provided India has a domestic policy that encourages cooperation under the Atmanirbharta. Say, look, can we work with other companies? Or a triangular participation, European technology, Israeli money, Emirates money, and we have the production. So all kinds of possibilities exist, provided we are far more open about what is at hand. But I want to say one thing about Egypt. I mean, I think Egypt is really had this relations with Israel long before anybody else in the Middle East. But today, Egypt is trying to come back because Egypt's relative position has declined over the decades. And India itself has not been very enthusiastic. They've had problems with us. But today, Egypt's natural position at the cusp of, there is Europe and Mediterranean, there is Africa at the bottom, there is, West Asia, it sits in the middle. And its Red Sea is really what connects Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. So they're coming out, and they're very strongly moderate country. They fought the brotherhood domestically, saying that, look, we don't want political Islam. We want a more moderate, secular type of regime. So I think the kind of convergences that exist between India and Egypt are real. And I think time for us to pay fresh attention to Egypt and to expand our relationship so that can, between Greece and India, and in between UAE, there is also Egypt, which can provide a real depth to the Indo-Abrahamic accord, if you will, that can be constructed.
Great, sir. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week. Everyone, the piece is on the Indian Express website, on our social media handles, and probably wherever you're watching this video in the description. Thanks so much, sir.